Welcome to the channel The Black Liturgy. Today, we unveil a truth concealed for more than a century and a half. This is the story of Ada Coleman, an enslaved girl in 1868 whose remarkable memory helped solve crimes and exposed a secret system that kept boys and girls enslaved well into the 1940s. What you are about to hear was never meant to be known. This story is difficult and intense. Breathe deeply, listen closely, and let these voices from the past finally be heard. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and comment below which city and country you're listening from. Your engagement helps ensure these stories are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. Taken in 1932, this photograph demands a careful look. In the middle of a Mississippi cotton field stands a young black girl, no older than 8. Her hands are raw. Her back is bent. Her eyes hold a weight no child should ever carry. Now, here is the question that will change everything you thought you knew about American history. Slavery was abolished in 1865. So why, 67 years later, was this child still working the fields exactly as her great-grandmother did under slavery? The answer is a secret America buried for over 150 years. Today, we unearth it. On January 1, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the nation believed a new era had dawned. When the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, the words were unmistakable: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. 4 million enslaved people were finally free. Families torn apart for generations could now reunite. Parents could hold their children without fear of losing them. The chains were broken. The nightmare was over. At least, that's what the history books told us. But across the American South, in small towns and sprawling plantations, a different story was unfolding, a story that would stay hidden for generations. A story of children stolen from their parents in broad daylight, not by criminals, but by the law itself. A story of boys and girls declared free by the Constitution, yet enslaved by a system so cunning, so perfectly designed, it operated in plain sight for nearly a century. This is the story of the apprenticeship system. This is the story America never wanted you to know. To grasp what happened after slavery, we must first understand slavery's role in the Southern economy. Before the Civil War, enslaved people were not just workers, they were the foundation of an entire way of life. In 1860, the total value of enslaved people in the United States was roughly $3.5 billion. To put that in perspective, that sum exceeded the value of all the railroads and factories in the entire country combined. Enslaved people were America's single largest financial asset. When slavery ended, white plantation owners didn't just lose their workers, they lost their wealth, their power, their entire identity. And they were not about to accept that without a fight. In the spring of 1865, as defeated Confederate soldiers returned home, the white planter class faced a crisis like never before. The question was simple yet terrifying: who would work the fields now? Who would pick the cotton, harvest the tobacco, cook the meals, and clean the houses, all the work enslaved people had done for 250 years? The formerly enslaved were now free to leave, free to demand wages, free to say no. For the first time in American history, black people had choices. And this terrified the white South more than anything. Within months of the war's end, white politicians across the former Confederacy began meeting in secret. They gathered in courthouses and plantation homes, in state legislatures and private clubs. They had one goal: find a legal way to keep black people in chains. Not literally, of course, the 13th Amendment prevented that. But there had to be another way, some loophole, some legal trick to continue using black labor without calling it slavery. And they found it. They called it the Black Codes. Passed in southern states starting in late 1865, these laws began with Mississippi in November, followed swiftly by South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and the rest. Each state's laws varied slightly, but all shared the same purpose: to control the newly freed black population and force them back to work on the plantations. Clever in their cruelty, the codes granted black people just enough rights to claim slavery wasn't being re-established. Black people could now legally marry, own certain property, make contracts, and testify in court, but only in cases involving other black people. These were crumbs tossed from the table to create an illusion of freedom. But hidden within these codes was the poison that would destroy black families for generations: the apprenticeship system. Here's how it worked: if a black child was an orphan, or if a local court decided the child's parents were unfit or unable to provide, that child could be taken by the state and bound as an apprentice to a white employer. In exchange for the child's labor, the employer would supposedly teach them a trade and provide food, clothing, and shelter. The child would remain bound until adulthood, usually 18 for girls, 21 for boys, without receiving a single penny in wages. Now, here's where the system revealed its true evil. Who decided if black parents were unfit? White judges. Who were these judges? Often, they were former Confederate soldiers and plantation owners, friends and relatives of the very people who wanted black labor. What standard did they use? Whatever standard they wanted. A black family could be living stably, working steadily, caring perfectly for their children, and still have those children taken simply because a white judge said so. But the system went deeper. The black codes included a former master preference. This meant that when a black child was bound as an apprentice, their former slave master had the first right to claim them. Think about that. A child enslaved on a plantation until 1865 could be declared an orphan or the child of unfit parents in 1866 and handed right back to their former enslaver. Same plantation, same work, same conditions. Only the paperwork was different. The case of Oni Cunningham shows exactly how this system operated. On November 21, 1865, just 2 weeks after Mississippi passed its black codes, a contract of indenture was issued by the Freedmen's Bureau itself. This contract bound Oni Cunningham, described as a free girl of color, to a man named Alex Cunningham. Oni was 9. The contract stated she would learn the art of housekeeping until she turned 18. 9 years of unpaid labor, 9 years of servitude, 9 years of stolen childhood. The man she was bound to shared her last name, because he was almost certainly her former owner. This wasn't apprenticeship. This was slavery with different paperwork. But Oni Cunningham was not alone. Across the South, thousands of children were being taken. In Maryland, the situation was especially severe. With a long history of using apprenticeship laws, white plantation owners there moved quickly to exploit the system. Between September 1865 and September 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau apprenticed hundreds of black children, some infants, some teenagers. Some were bound to learn skilled trades, but many were bound simply to serve as apprentices or servants. The word servant was a thin disguise for what they really meant: slave. In Russell County, Alabama, a man named Nathan Cox and his wife Jenny had survived slavery together. They had children. They had hope. When freedom came in 1865, they believed they could finally live as a family without fear. But their former master, Francis Jones, had other plans. Within weeks of the 13th Amendment's ratification, Jones went to the local court. He told the judge Nathan and Jenny Cox were unable to care for their children. The judge, a friend of Jones, agreed. The Cox children were taken and bound as apprentices to Francis Jones, the same man who had enslaved them, on the same plantation where they'd been born into bondage. Nathan and Jenny Cox fought back. They went to the courts, filed petitions, begged for their children's return. But the system was designed against them. The judges were former Confederates. The lawyers were plantation owners. Alabama's entire legal apparatus was controlled by the very people who had benefited from slavery. Every petition was denied. Every appeal rejected. The Cox children remained enslaved in all but name, working the same fields as before the war, receiving nothing for their labor. Nathan and Jenny Cox never got their children back. The case of Violet Maples reveals another layer of the system's cruelty. Violet was an enslaved woman on a southern plantation. She had several children, including one whose father was her white enslaver. When freedom came, Violet's dream was simple: gather her children and brothers and start a new life together. But this dream was destroyed almost immediately. Her former master used the apprenticeship laws to keep her children. When Violet tried to reclaim them, she faced an impossible obstacle. Under slavery, black marriages weren't legally recognized. In the eyes of the law, Violet was an unmarried woman, and unmarried black women were routinely labeled loose women or women of bad character. This label was then used as proof they were unfit mothers. Violet's children were kept from her, not because she was a bad mother, but because the system punished her for a marriage slavery itself had refused to recognize. What made this system especially insidious was its use of the language of charity and benevolence. White plantation owners didn't say they were re-enslaving black children. They said they were helping them. They claimed black parents couldn't provide, that black children needed white guidance to learn valuable skills, that apprenticeship was actually good for black families. The entire system was wrapped in the language of care and concern while committing acts of profound violence. The historical record shows exactly what these apprenticeships taught. One court document from the period lists the skills black children would supposedly learn. For boys, it was usually farming. For girls, housekeeping. Farming meant picking cotton, harvesting tobacco, clearing land, the same back-breaking work enslaved people had always done. Housekeeping meant cooking, cleaning, caring for white children, the same domestic work enslaved women had always done. There was no education, no training in valuable trades, no preparation for independent life. Only endless, unpaid work. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to protect black families. Created by Congress in March 1865 to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, Bureau agents were stationed across the South to ensure fair treatment, protected rights, and kept families together. But the Bureau was overwhelmed and underfunded. There were never enough agents to monitor what was happening. And in many cases, the agents themselves were complicit, signing the contracts, approving the indentures, handing black children over to white employers. The very agency created to protect freedom became a tool for continuing slavery. By 1866, the scope of this crisis was becoming clear. Thousands of black children across the South had been taken. Entire communities were torn apart. Black newspapers and churches raised the alarm. Frederick Douglass spoke out. Abolitionists who had fought to end slavery were horrified to see it returning in a new form. Congress responded by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, meant to give black people more legal protections. But in the South, these federal laws meant little. Local courts simply ignored them. White judges kept taking black children. White employers kept using black labor without pay. The system continued. What the apprenticeship system revealed was a fundamental truth about slavery. Slavery was never just about legal ownership. It was about control. It was about power. It was about forcing people to work for nothing. And as long as you could achieve these goals, it didn't matter what you called it. Apprenticeship. Training. Charity. As long as black children worked without pay, as long as black families were torn apart, as long as black people had no real power to resist, slavery continued. The chains were invisible, but just as strong. The apprenticeship system was just one part of a larger strategy. The black codes included many other provisions to control black labor. Vagrancy laws made it illegal for black people to be unemployed. If a black man couldn't prove he had a job, he could be arrested, fined, and forced to work without pay. Labor contract laws required black workers to sign year-long contracts with white employers at the start of each year. If they left early, they could be arrested and forced back. If they were late, their wages could be docked. If they talked back, they could be whipped. Anti-enticement laws made it illegal to offer a black worker a better job, so even if they found an employer willing to pay more, they couldn't accept without risking arrest. Together, these laws created a web of control that made true freedom almost impossible. A black family in the South faced an impossible choice: sign exploitative contracts and work for almost nothing, or refuse and be arrested as vagrants. Their children could be taken at any moment if a white judge decided they were unfit. They couldn't leave for better opportunities. Anti-enticement laws prevented it. They couldn't vote. Most states hadn't given black people that right yet. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't testify against white people in court. They were free in name only. In every practical sense, they were still enslaved. The response from black communities was remarkable. Despite overwhelming obstacles, black parents fought desperately to reclaim their children. They traveled hundreds of miles to file petitions, hired lawyers when they could, appealed to the Freedmen's Bureau, wrote letters to newspapers, organized through churches. They did everything in their power to reunite their families. The Freedmen's Bureau records are filled with heartbreaking petitions from black parents begging for their children back. These documents give voice to people history tried to silence, revealing a depth of love and determination no system could fully destroy. One petition from a black mother in North Carolina tells the story in her own words. She describes how her children were taken just months after freedom, the cruel employer who took them, her attempts to see her children blocked at every turn. She begs the Bureau for help, for justice. We don't know if she ever got her children back, but her words survive. Her voice reaches across 150 years to remind us these were real people, real families, real children, not statistics, not abstractions, but human beings who loved, suffered, and fought for their freedom. The legal battles over apprenticeship reached state supreme courts. In Maryland, a case called in re Turner became one of the most important challenges to the system. A black woman named Elizabeth Turner had been bound as an apprentice after the war. She argued it was illegal, violating the Civil Rights Act. The case eventually reached Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court Salmon P. Chase, riding circuit in Maryland. Chase ruled in Elizabeth Turner's favor, declaring Maryland's apprenticeship laws a violation of federal law. It was a significant victory, but not enough. Despite the ruling, enforcement was nearly impossible. Local courts across the South continued to bind black children as apprentices. The law had spoken, but power lay with those who ignored it. By the time Reconstruction began in earnest, the apprenticeship system was deeply entrenched. Radical Republicans in Congress tried to dismantle the black codes. They passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection, and the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. They sent federal troops to the South to enforce these new rights. For a brief moment, real change seemed possible. Black men were elected to state legislatures and even Congress. Black families began building wealth and community. Schools were established. Churches flourished. This period, 1867 to 1877, represented the greatest expansion of black freedom since the nation's founding. But the forces of white supremacy never stopped fighting. The Ku Klux Klan launched campaigns of terror against black families. White mobs attacked black voters. Black politicians were assassinated. Black schools were burned. And in the background, the economic systems that kept black people in bondage continued to evolve. The apprenticeship system adapted. When federal attention was high, white employers used other methods. When it waned, they returned to the old ways. The children kept working. The families kept suffering. The system kept turning. In 1877, everything changed. The disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden led to a secret deal. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was over. The federal government abandoned black people to their fate. Within years, white supremacist governments retook power across the South. The gains of Reconstruction were systematically destroyed. The systems of control that had operated semi-secretly during Reconstruction now operated openly. The end of Reconstruction didn't end the apprenticeship system, it allowed it to operate with complete impunity. Without federal oversight, no one challenged the local courts. Without federal troops, no one protected black families. The taking of black children continued into the 1880s, 1890s, and the new century. The system didn't truly begin to decline until the Child Welfare Act of 1919. And even then, exemptions for agricultural labor meant black children on farms remained unprotected. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally banned most child labor in factories and mines, but agricultural labor was specifically exempted. And where did most black children in the South work? On farms. In fields. Picking cotton and tobacco, just as their ancestors had during slavery. This brings us back to that photograph from 1932. That little girl in the cotton field wasn't an accident. She wasn't an exception. She was the product of a system operating for nearly 70 years, a system that used the language of law and charity to steal children from their parents, that used the power of the courts to force children into unpaid labor, that operated in plain sight while the rest of America looked away. Her great-grandmother might have been enslaved before 1865. Her grandmother might have been taken as an apprentice after the war. Her mother might have been trapped in debt peonage or sharecropping. And she, in 1932, was still in the fields. For generations. 70 years after abolition. Still not free. The apprenticeship system was just the beginning, the first tool white Southerners used to maintain slavery after it was legally abolished. But it wasn't the last. The same impulse created convict leasing. This system used the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which allowed slavery as punishment for crime, to create a new form of bondage. Black people were arrested for minor, often fabricated, offenses, convicted in sham trials, and leased to private companies to work in mines, factories, and plantations. Conditions were often worse than slavery. An enslaved person before the war was valuable property to be protected. A convict laborer after the war was expendable. If one died, there were always more. The same impulse also created debt peonage. Under this system, black workers were trapped in cycles of debt they could never escape. They'd borrow money from a landowner for seeds, tools, and supplies. At harvest, they'd sell their crops to the same landowner, who set the prices. Somehow, the amount they owed was always more than the value of their crops. They ended each year deeper in debt. And because they owed money, they couldn't leave. If they tried, they could be arrested and forced back. Generation after generation was trapped, working land they'd never own, creating wealth they'd never share. The history of black children in America after slavery is a history of stolen futures, of potential never allowed to develop. Every child who picked cotton instead of learning to read was a loss. Every child separated from loving parents was a tragedy. Every child who worked without pay while white children went to school was an injustice. And these injustices didn't end when the children grew up. They passed down through generations. The grandmother who couldn't read couldn't help her grandchildren with schoolwork. The family that never accumulated wealth couldn't pass anything down. The trauma of separation and exploitation became part of the family story, shaping lives for generations. Historian Mary Frances Berry spent years tracing the family trees of children taken under the apprenticeship system. Her research, published in her book Slavery After Slavery, reveals the intergenerational impact. She followed families from 1865 to the present, documenting how the theft of children's labor after the war created ripples still felt today. Families torn apart in 1866 still deal with the consequences. Wealth stolen through unpaid labor was never recovered. Educational opportunities denied could never be reclaimed. The damage wasn't temporary, it was permanent and ongoing. What makes this history so difficult is how thoroughly it was buried. Most Americans have never heard of the apprenticeship system. It isn't taught in schools. It doesn't appear in most history books. The black codes are often mentioned briefly, then passed over as a minor inconvenience rather than a systematic attempt to re-enslave 4 million people. The focus is almost always on the 13th Amendment as a moment of liberation, not the decades of struggle that followed. This erasure isn't accidental. It serves a purpose. If Americans don't know what happened after slavery, they can't understand why inequality persists today. If Americans believe slavery truly ended in 1865, they can tell themselves black people have had the same opportunities as everyone else for 160 years. The truth is far more complicated. The truth is, freedom wasn't given, it was fought for. And in many ways, that fight continues. We have now reached the end of the first part of this story. But we are far from finished. In the next part, we will go deeper into the systems that evolved from apprenticeship. We will explore convict leasing, which scholars have called worse than slavery. We will examine debt peonage and sharecropping, which trapped millions in cycles of poverty. We will follow the story through the 20th century to when these systems finally began to crumble. And we will ask the question America has avoided for too long: what do we owe to the descendants of these children? What does justice look like after 150 years of injustice? The story isn't over. It is only beginning.